The pen was already in my hand when he said it. "Just sign it, Melissa. It's better for everyone. Vanessa can't have kids of her own. You can always have another one." He was talking about our daughter, 11 days old, sleeping in a bassinet 4 feet away from us, her tiny fist curled up next to her cheek like she was still deciding whether this world was worth waking up for. I looked at the paper in front of me, then I looked at him. Then I smiled, the kind of smile you give a stranger who just stepped on your foot on the subway and doesn't know it yet. "Okay," I said. "Give me the pen." He grinned like he'd won something. He had no idea what he'd just started. My name is Melissa Carver, and this is the story of the day my husband asked me to hand our newborn baby to the woman he was cheating with, and the very quiet, very legal way I made sure he lost everything he actually cared about instead. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I was before that night, and who Daniel Carver really was underneath all that charm. I met Daniel when I was 26 years old. At the time, I was working as a contracts paralegal at a mid-sized law firm in Columbus, Ohio called Whitfield and Marsh. It's the kind of firm that handles a lot of estate work, business disputes, and family law cases. I wasn't a lawyer. I want to be honest about that from the start. I went to law school for 2 years, but I had to drop out when my father got sick with a heart condition and the money for tuition just wasn't there anymore. I took a paralegal job instead, thinking it would be temporary. 9 years later, I was still there, and by then, I'd read so many contracts, trusts, and custody agreements that some of the actual attorneys at the firm started handing me their drafts before filing, just to get a second set of eyes. I had a talent, it turned out, for finding the one sentence buried on page 14 that quietly changed the entire meaning of a document. It's a strange thing to be proud of, but please remember that detail. It matters a great deal later in the story. Daniel was a sales director for a regional medical equipment company that supplied hospitals and clinics across 3 states. He was charming in that specific way salesmen often are. He remembered your coffee order after hearing it once. He laughed at your jokes half a second before you even finished telling them. He had this gift for making you feel like you were the only interesting person in any room he walked into. We met at a mutual friend's engagement party, one of those loud, crowded events where everyone's had 2 glasses of wine and is louder than usual. He asked what I did for work, and when I explained the paralegal job, he smiled and said, "So you're basically a lawyer who doesn't get paid like one." I laughed at that. I probably shouldn't have found it as charming as I did, but I did, and that was that. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. He did it at a restaurant on the Columbus riverfront, dropped to one knee in front of maybe 40 strangers eating their dinners. The whole dramatic show complete with a violin player he'd apparently hired without telling me. I said yes. My mother cried real tears. My best friend, a woman named Priya Anand, who I had known since our freshman year of college, did not cry. She just stood off to the side, watching him across the room with this careful, unreadable expression on her face. Later that night, once we had a quiet moment together, she told me, "He's charming, Mel. Charming men are easy to marry and very hard to leave." I told her she was overthinking things. I want to say clearly, right now, at the start of this story, that she was right and I was wrong, because Priya becomes very important later on. We got married when I was 29. It was a small wedding, only 60 guests, held at a vineyard just outside Dayton. Daniel's mother, a woman named Carol Carver, gave a toast that somehow ended up being mostly about herself and her late husband. But everyone laughed politely and moved on the way people do at weddings. Daniel's younger sister, Rachel Carver Boyd, stepped in as a backup bridesmaid when my actual maid of honor came down with food poisoning 2 days before the ceremony, and she handled it beautifully, calm and organized under pressure. I liked Rachel from the very beginning. I still do. Hold on to that thought too, because it matters later. For the first 4 years of our marriage, things were what I would call normal good. Not a fairy tale, but solid, dependable. The kind of marriage where you don't think too hard about whether you're happy because you're too busy living your life. Daniel worked long hours and traveled constantly for his job, sometimes 10 or 12 days out of every month, covering hospital accounts across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. I kept working at the firm, slowly building a reputation as the person who caught mistakes before they became expensive problems. We bought a house together in Westerville, a decent 3-bedroom with a half-finished basement that Daniel kept promising, year after year, to turn into a home theater. We talked about having children starting around our 3rd year of marriage. It took us 2 years of trying seriously, 1 miscarriage at 9 weeks that we quietly didn't tell anyone about, And finally, on what felt like our last real attempt before we considered other options, I got pregnant with our daughter. I need to plant something important here, because it becomes the center of everything that happens later in this story. When I was about 14 weeks pregnant, my great-aunt Dorothy, my grandmother's younger sister, passed away. I barely knew her, if I'm honest. I had met her maybe 6 or 7 times in my entire life, mostly at holiday gatherings when I was a child, but she left me $340,000 in a trust, along with 2 small commercial properties she'd owned for decades, because, according to her estate lawyer, you were the only one in the family who ever sent a birthday card without being asked first. That single sentence still gets to me, all these years later. Here is the important part, the part I need you to remember clearly. That money went into an irrevocable trust set up entirely in my name, established by Aunt Dorothy's estate attorney, a sharp, precise woman named Constance Whitfield, who happened to be related to the very same Whitfield of Whitfield and Marsh, the firm where I worked. That connection is exactly why the trust ended up drafted so carefully and cleanly. Daniel knew the money existed in a general sense. He had heard me mention it once or twice, but he never once asked about the specific details, the structure, or the legal status of that inheritance. He assumed, because he never bothered to actually ask, that once we were married, all of it was simply our money, sitting somewhere he could access if he ever needed to. I never corrected that assumption, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't because I was hiding something sinister or planning ahead for a divorce I didn't yet know was coming. I simply never saw a reason to sit him down and explain trust law to a man who had never once asked me a single specific question about our finances beyond checking the balance of our shared checking account. That gap between what he assumed and what was actually true sat quietly in the background of our marriage for years, like a loaded gun left on a table nobody ever mentioned. You will see exactly why that gun mattered before the story's over. I gave birth to our daughter on a Tuesday morning in March. We named her Josephine, Josie for short, after my grandmother on my mother's side. She weighed 7 pounds and 2 ounces. Daniel cried real tears in the delivery room, and for a few hours afterward, exhausted and sore as I was, I remember thinking, this is it. This is the good chapter of my life, finally starting for real. That feeling lasted exactly 4 days. On day 4, home from the hospital, running on maybe 9 total hours of broken sleep spread across 4 nights, I found a text message on Daniel's phone. He had left it sitting on the kitchen counter while he showered, and it lit up with an incoming message right as I was warming a bottle for Josie. I want to be clear that I wasn't snooping in that moment. The message simply appeared on the locked screen where anyone standing at the counter could read it. The name attached to the message was simply V. The message said, and I remember every word of it exactly, "Any update on the paperwork? I want this settled before she gets too attached." I stood there in my own kitchen, holding a warm bottle in one hand, my newborn daughter crying softly in the next room, and I read that single sentence 4 separate times before it fully made sense to me. I did not confront him that night. I want to be completely honest about that, because it wasn't bravery on my part, and it wasn't some brilliant strategic decision either, at least not yet. I was simply too exhausted, too physically sore, too many stitches still healing from the delivery, to do anything except quietly climb back into bed and lie there wide awake until nearly 4 in the morning, turning that one sentence over and over in my mind. The next morning, once Daniel left for what he called a quick errand, I did something I'm not entirely proud of and also don't regret one bit. I went through his phone properly, message by message, photo by photo. I found a calendar entry from 3 weeks earlier labeled simply Dr. Reyes V. I looked up Dr. Reyes online. He was a fertility specialist with an office about 20 minutes from our house. Cross-referencing the name in the message thread, I found her full name, Vanessa Ortiz Meyer. Vanessa Ortiz Meyer was 34 years old. According to messages that stretched back nearly a year, she had been a client of Daniel's medical supply company, responsible for purchasing decisions at a hospital he covered as part of his sales territory. She had been unable to carry a pregnancy to full term after 2 failed rounds of IVF, followed by a hysterectomy at the age of 31. Daniel had been seeing her, based on the earliest messages I could find in his phone, since roughly 5 months into my own pregnancy with Josie. But here is the detail that turned this from an ordinary, painful affair into something else entirely, something I still have trouble fully explaining to people. In one message, dated about 6 weeks before Josie was born, Vanessa wrote to him, I still think about what you said, about giving her to me if it's a girl. Were you serious? And Daniel wrote back, without a single second of hesitation as far as I could tell from the timestamps, dead serious. Melissa doesn't even want another kid right now. She said so herself. It'll be easier than you think. I had never said anything remotely close to that. Not once, not in any context, not even as a joke during a hard week of pregnancy. He had constructed an entire narrative inside his own head, one that made this unthinkable plan sound reasonable, even kind to himself, and apparently convincing enough to sell to a grieving, desperate woman who badly wanted to become a mother. I sat down on the kitchen floor with Josie's bottle slowly going cold in my hand, and I made a decision in about 90 seconds that I never once looked back from for the rest of this story. I decided I was not going to scream. I was not going to cry in front of him, not even once. I was going to become the calmest, most patient, most agreeable person he had ever encountered in his entire life, right up until the exact moment I had everything I needed to end this on my terms. Because I already understood from 9 years of reading contracts professionally that in any legal or financial conflict, the person who panics first, who reacts first, who shows their hand first, is almost always the person who ends up losing. So I closed the phone. I set it back exactly where it had been sitting on the counter. And I walked into the next room and held my daughter until she fell back asleep. And I did not say a single word to Daniel that day, or the day after that, or the day after that one either. It took him 9 more days to actually say any of it to my face. He came home from what he called a work trip, though I now know it wasn't entirely a work trip, at least not for the whole duration, and he sat down across from me at our kitchen table holding a manila folder in his hand. He used the same calm, reasonable, practiced tone he used on hospital purchasing managers when he was pitching a new line of surgical equipment. Looking back now, that tone should have unsettled me the very first time I ever heard it, years earlier when we were still just dating. Instead, back then, I had found it charming. "I need to talk to you about something serious," he said, folding his hands on the table like he was opening a business meeting. "And I need you to really hear me out before you react to anything." I said absolutely nothing. I simply waited. That silence, I would learn over the following weeks, unsettled him far more than any amount of yelling ever could have. He told me about Vanessa. Not the whole truth, of course, but a softened, sanitized version. The way people usually confess only to the parts of a story that feel survivable to admit out loud. He said they had developed feelings for one another over the past year. He said she couldn't have children of her own, through absolutely no fault of hers. "It's just a medical thing, Mel. You'd understand completely if you actually met her." And then, without any further warning, he opened the folder and slid a single document across the table toward me. It was a private adoption consent form. It had already been pre-filled with Josie's full name, her date of birth, and her social security number. There was a signature line at the bottom for me, and a separate line for him, both relinquishing our parental rights as part of a private arrangement with Vanessa Ortiz-Meyer listed by name as the receiving party. He had apparently found some cut-corner lawyer willing to draft this kind of document quickly, almost certainly betting on the fact that a sleep-deprived, emotionally shattered new mother might sign nearly anything just to make an unbearable conversation stop happening. "She can't have her own baby, Melissa," he said, in the exact tone you might use to explain a simple, obvious kindness to someone slow to understand it. And honestly, if we're being real with each other, we already have so much on our plate right now. You're barely sleeping most nights. Your firm's expecting you back at your desk in 6 weeks. This could actually be a relief for you, if you really stop and think it through. Vanessa would give Josie an incredible life, a stable life, everything she could possibly need. And you and I, we could try again together. Later, when things are calmer for both of us. When it's just us again. I looked down at that piece of paper sitting on our kitchen table. Then I looked over at my daughter, sleeping soundly 4 feet away in her bassinet, one tiny fist still curled gently up beside her cheek. And this next part is the entire reason I am telling you this story today. I smiled at him. I said calmly, "Okay, give me the pen." His face lit up with obvious relief. The kind of relief you see on someone who is bracing for a screaming match and instead got a clean, easy, uncomplicated win. He handed me the pen without a moment's hesitation, and I signed the document. I did not sign the line relinquishing Josie. I signed the top of the form instead, on a line he apparently hadn't even noticed existed. A completely separate signature block labeled, witness acknowledgement. Under Ohio law, that line does absolutely nothing except confirm that I personally witnessed the document existing on that particular date. It carries zero legal weight regarding custody. It waives no rights whatsoever. 9 years spent reading contracts for a living had taught me precisely where the real legal teeth of any document actually live, and precisely which lines are simply decoys meant to look official. Daniel, a man who sold surgical staplers for a living and had never in his life read a legal document more complicated than a car lease agreement, had absolutely no idea there was any difference at all. He believed completely and totally that I had just surrendered. What I had actually done was quietly obtain hard, dated physical proof, written in both our own hands, of exactly what he had asked me to do to our own child. I want to pause the story here and tell you honestly what the following 6 weeks looked like from the outside, because on the surface, almost nothing appeared to change at all. I was still exhausted from broken sleep. I still woke up every 2 hours through the night to feed Josie. I still smiled at Daniel across the breakfast table every single morning. I still packed his bag carefully whenever he left for another work trip. I even asked him once, gently, in a tone so mild it genuinely disarmed him, how things with Vanessa were progressing. And he actually thanked me afterward for being, in his words, so mature about all of this. Underneath that calm surface, though, I was doing something entirely different. I was quietly, methodically building a file. I called Priya first, not simply as a friend to vent to, though I badly needed that too, but as a friend who happened to be, by that point, 4 years deep into her own career as a family law attorney, having finished the very law degree I had been forced to walk away from years earlier. She met me at a small coffee shop 2 towns over from Westerville, deliberately far enough away that nobody from our neighborhood would recognize either of us sitting together. I set my phone down on the table between us and showed her every single message. Priya read through all of it twice, slowly, without saying a word. She didn't say, "I told you so," even though she would have been entirely justified in saying it. She simply looked up at me and said very quietly, "Okay, here's exactly what we're going to do. And here's the one thing you are absolutely, under no circumstances, going to do, which is tell him anything at all about what's coming." Over the following month and a half, this is roughly what unfolded behind the scenes, while my daily life with Daniel appeared completely unchanged. I photographed and backed up every single message, every calendar entry, the entire adoption consent draft, and even the letterhead of the lawyer who had drafted it. A small, sloppy solo operation, it turned out, run by a man who had already been formally reprimanded twice by the Ohio State Bar Association for cutting corners on official filings. Priya helped me quietly begin preparing a divorce petition, one built specifically around Ohio's laws concerning marital misconduct, but far more importantly, built around the fact that Daniel had actively attempted to arrange the transfer of parental rights of a minor child to an unrelated third party without my informed and lawful consent, which, depending on how strictly a family court chooses to interpret it, edges disturbingly close to attempted illegal private adoption trafficking, a phrase that immediately got the attention of exactly the people I most needed it to get the attention of. At the very same time, on a completely separate and unrelated legal track, I quietly insured Aunt Dorothy's trust. The $340,000, along with the 2 commercial properties, was fully documented and clearly separated from any shared marital visibility. It had always legally been separate property under Ohio law, since it existed as an inheritance held within an individual trust and had never once been commingled into any joint account we shared. Daniel had simply never bothered to verify any of this for himself. He had spent 4 full years assuming that money was somehow ours, without ever once asking Constance Whitfield, the trust's attorney, a single direct question about its actual structure. With Constance's careful help, I made absolutely certain the paperwork was airtight and fully current, so that once the divorce filing eventually became public, there would be zero ambiguity left for any judge to rule on regarding that particular asset. There would simply be nothing shared to divide, because there had never legally been anything shared in the first place. During this stretch of quiet preparation, there is one specific moment I still think about more often than almost anything else in this entire story. Josie was about 10 weeks old at the time. Daniel was traveling again, supposedly for a sales conference in Pittsburgh, though I now understood he was very likely traveling with Vanessa instead. Rachel, his younger sister, came over one afternoon to help me out, purely because she could see, without knowing any of the real reasons why, that I looked exhausted in a way that went well beyond simple new mother tiredness. She was holding Josie in her arms, gently rocking her back and forth near the living room window. And she looked down at her and said, almost more to herself than to me, "You're so lucky, you know that? You've got two parents who would honestly do anything for you." Josie simply blinked up at her the way tiny newborns often do, as if she were quietly absorbing something important and carefully filing it away for much later. I had to step out of the room for a few minutes after hearing that. I didn't tell Rachel anything about what was actually happening yet. It wasn't because I didn't trust her completely, because I did, and I still do to this day. It was because Priya had warned me early on that the fewer people who knew anything before the paperwork was fully filed, the fewer opportunities Daniel would have to catch even a small whisper and start hiding assets or deleting messages in a panic. I genuinely hated keeping Rachel in the dark during those weeks, but I had already decided this entire process was going to remain quiet, controlled, and completely airtight from start to finish, and quiet in that moment, unfortunately, meant quiet with everyone, even people I loved and trusted. By roughly week 7 after that original kitchen table conversation, everything was finally ready. Priya had the divorce petition fully finalized, along with a custody filing built around full physical and legal custody for me, with supervised visitation for Daniel pending a formal court review, plus a formal written complaint prepared for the State Medical Licensing Board regarding Daniel's employer, because it turned out Vanessa Ortiz-Meyer wasn't merely a former client of his company. She was still, at that exact moment, an active current client, still receiving medical equipment shipments processed through Daniel's own sales accounts, and their relationship had clearly begun, while he was still directly managing her hospital's purchasing account, which amounted to, at an absolute minimum, a serious professional conflict of interest violation that his employer, once it landed properly on the right desk, took extremely seriously. I chose the exact timing very carefully. Daniel's mother, Carol Carver, was hosting a family dinner specifically to celebrate the new baby. A full 6 weeks later, than most families would typically wait to do something like that, though Carol always preferred planning things entirely around her own schedule rather than anyone else's convenience. Rachel would be there. Carol's older sister, Aunt Linda, would be there as well. It was, as far as Daniel understood it walking in that evening, going to be an easy, pleasant family gathering where everyone quietly cooed over baby Josie, and he got to play the role of the proud, doting father in front of his entire family. I brought a folder with me. Dinner proceeded completely normally for the first full hour. Josie slept peacefully in her car seat beside my chair the entire time. Carol made a passing comment about how well I had bounced back physically from the pregnancy, a remark I understood, even in that moment, wasn't really intended as a genuine compliment. Daniel refilled my wine glass attentively throughout the meal, charming as always in front of his family, and at one point he even placed his hand gently over mine on the tablecloth and announced, loudly enough for the entire table to hear clearly, "We're just so grateful for this little girl. Everything's honestly been so good since she arrived." I let him finish speaking completely, as I always did throughout this entire process. Then I quietly set my wine glass down on the table, and I opened the folder. "I want to share something important with the whole family," I said. My voice was completely level, almost gentle. "Since we're all conveniently gathered here together tonight." I placed 3 separate documents on the table, one at a time, slowly enough that everyone present could actually read each one clearly. The private adoption consent form, dated, with Vanessa's full name typed neatly into the recipient line. A printed copy of the text messages, specifically including the one where Daniel had written, "It'll be easier than you think." And finally, a fresh copy of the divorce petition, already officially filed that very morning with the Franklin County Clerk of Courts, complete with an official case number stamped clearly across the top of the page. Nobody at that table said a single word for what felt like an extraordinarily long stretch of silence. Carol picked up the adoption consent form first. I watched her read through it carefully, word by word. I watched her expression change slowly, the way ice gradually cracks when you pour warm water over it. Not all at once, but in small, visible fractures spreading outward. Rachel read the printed text messages over her mother's shoulder and immediately brought one hand up to cover her own mouth in shock. Daniel reached across the table for the folder, instinctively, as though he might still somehow take it back, as though this were still just a private conversation strictly between the two of us. I calmly moved the folder 2 inches further out of his reach, the same unhurried way you might move a hot pan safely away from a curious child's reaching hand. "You told me to sign it," I said, my voice still completely level, still quiet. So, I did sign it, Daniel. I signed a witness line, not a consent line. You never actually bothered to read the document you personally handed me across our kitchen table. You simply assumed I would fall apart emotionally and sign whatever you put in front of me. I need all of you right now in this room to hear me say this clearly. I would never, under any circumstances whatsoever, hand our daughter over to the woman you were quietly building an entire paper trail to give her to. That outcome was never once a real possibility, from the very first moment you suggested it. You simply spent the last several weeks feeling relieved over absolutely nothing. That was the exact quiet threat I had promised myself, delivered in full, calmly, in front of the very people whose opinion of him mattered most in his entire life. Carol set the adoption form back down on the table like it had physically burned her fingers. She turned to her son and said very quietly, in a voice I'd never heard her use before, "Daniel, what exactly is this?" He didn't have a single answer that survived actual contact with that room. He tried saying, "It's complicated," and Rachel, God bless her completely, immediately replied, "It's actually really not complicated at all, though." And that response effectively ended any defense he attempted to mount for the remainder of that evening. I want to be very clear about something important here. I did not scream at him. I did not throw my wine glass across the room. I did not call Vanessa any names, and I did not demand that Daniel explain himself dramatically in front of everyone like some kind of daytime television confrontation. I said exactly what I needed to say, once, clearly and completely, and then I calmly picked up Josie's car seat, thanked Carol politely for hosting dinner in a tone of voice so completely normal, it visibly unsettled everyone at that table even further, and I walked out the front door. That was the entire payback, not a dramatic scene. A single carefully organized file, an official filing date, and one sentence that simply couldn't be argued against by anyone present. The aftermath of that evening took roughly 14 months to fully settle into place, and I'm not going to pretend it was instantly clean or simple, because that isn't how real life actually works, even when you've done every single thing exactly right. The divorce officially finalized 8 months later. I was granted full physical and legal custody of Josie, with Daniel receiving supervised visitation for the first full year, eventually moving to standard, unsupervised visitation once a court-appointed evaluator formally confirmed there was no ongoing safety concern involved. Daniel's attorney did fight the characterization of that adoption consent form in court, arguing it represented a moment of poor judgment during an extremely stressful period, which is certainly one creative way to describe attempting to arrange your own infant daughter's private adoption to your mistress. The presiding judge, a woman named Judge Patricia Alwyn, was not particularly moved by that specific framing. She ultimately granted me almost exactly the custody arrangement Priya had originally requested in the filing. Financially, the entire process turned out to be far less complicated than it might have been, simply because there was nothing left to actually divide. Aunt Dorothy's trust remained exactly where it had always legally existed, mine alone, entirely separate, completely untouched by any of this. Daniel kept his retirement account and his car, and eventually he kept his job as well, though not without real professional cost. The conflict of interest complaint I had formally filed regarding his handling of Vanessa's hospital purchasing account triggered a serious internal review within his company. He wasn't fired outright, but he was quietly moved off his lucrative sales territory into a lower-paying, compliance-focused position. Exactly the kind of quiet professional demotion that follows a person around for years without ever once making local news. Vanessa Ortiz-Meyer, as far as I've since heard through mutual professional connections, is no longer with him at all. Priya heard through her own legal network, which tends to be a surprisingly small and gossipy community, that their relationship didn't survive the scandal once it became public knowledge within their shared professional circles. I honestly don't know if that outcome counts as justice, or if it's simply an ordinary consequence playing out naturally. I've mostly stopped needing those two things to be the same thing in my own mind. I used a portion of Aunt Dorothy's inheritance to purchase a small 3-bedroom house located about 11 minutes from my old firm, situated in a quiet neighborhood with a genuinely good elementary school and a small park with a duck pond that Josie now insists we visit together every single Saturday morning without exception. I returned to work part-time at Whitfield and Marsh roughly 6 months after the divorce finalized, and within about 2 years, under Constance Whitfield's direct professional mentorship, I was promoted to senior paralegal. specializing somewhat ironically given everything that happened, specifically in family law and estate trust documentation. I now spend my working days helping other people build exactly the kind of airtight paperwork that ultimately protected both me and my daughter. It genuinely feels like the most honest job I have ever held in my entire career. Carol Carver and I are not particularly close these days, and I honestly don't think we ever will be again. She sent me exactly one card about 4 months after that dinner, which simply read, "I'm sorry we didn't see it sooner." I still keep that card tucked away in a kitchen drawer. I haven't yet decided what to actually do with it, and I've come to accept that I don't need to make that decision right now, or possibly ever. Some relationships simply remain unfinished permanently, and I've learned that's genuinely allowed. Rachel, on the other hand, shows up consistently every single month, and often more frequently than that. She's the one who patiently taught Josie how to ride a bicycle last summer, out in the quiet cul-de-sac outside my new house, running alongside her with one hand hovering carefully an inch above the bike seat, the exact way you do when you're honestly not sure yet whether it's finally safe to let go completely. Josie just turned 4 years old this past March. She doesn't remember any part of this story, obviously, and I hope she never has to carry the weight of it. She simply knows that Aunt Rachel visits every Sunday afternoon without fail, and that her mom works at the paper place downtown, and that we feed the ducks at our local park with the good bread specifically, never the cheap kind, because apparently the ducks deserve better than that. And my daughter has developed remarkably strong opinions on the subject. Daniel sees Josie every other weekend, consistently and reliably. He isn't a genuinely bad father in the ordinary, day-to-day sense of things. He shows up on time, he packs her lunch carefully, he taught himself how to braid hair from a YouTube tutorial video after she asked him to once, simply because he apparently didn't want to disappoint her by saying no. I honestly don't know if that means he's fundamentally changed as a person, or if it simply means he's had 4 long years to sit quietly with what he very nearly did to his own daughter. I've mostly stopped trying to figure out which explanation is actually true. It genuinely isn't my responsibility anymore to hold that particular question open on his behalf. Here's what I ultimately believe this entire story comes down to. If you strip away every specific detail and just look at the shape of it, somebody who has already decided quietly that you're going to fall apart under pressure will almost always badly underestimate exactly how much you're actually capable of holding together, calmly and privately, while they're still busy congratulating themselves on what they believe is an easy win. Daniel handed me that adoption consent form because he genuinely believed, completely and without doubt, that an exhausted, blind-sided, sleep-deprived new mother would simply do whatever she was told to do in that moment. He wasn't entirely wrong about the exhaustion part, if I'm being fully honest. He was catastrophically, completely wrong about absolutely everything else. I've come to believe that many of us get badly underestimated at precisely the moment we're actually gathering the very most inner strength we'll ever need. Grief tends to do that to people. Exhaustion does it too. Betrayal, more than almost anything else, does exactly that. People frequently mistake quiet silence for total surrender, when sometimes that same silence simply means you're carefully reading the fine print before you sign anything at all. Whether that's a literal legal document or simply an unspoken agreement about how the rest of your life is supposed to go from that point forward. If somebody in your own life has ever handed you a version of that exact same paper, a demand, an ultimatum, some decision they had already fully made on your behalf, and simply needed your signature to make it feel official, I would genuinely like to know what you personally did with that pen when it was placed in your hand. Tell me honestly in the comments below. I read absolutely every single one of them myself. If this particular story meant something real to you today, please subscribe to this channel, because there are many more stories just like mine still coming, and every single one of them ends exactly the same quiet way, on our own carefully chosen terms, and never anyone else's. I'll see you in the very next one.